All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I did enjoy my time here at the seminary, and not only was I here for 4 years, but I was also here 5 years later for another 4 years on the faculty. And while I enjoyed my time here, I feel much more like a fish in water out in the front lines, in the parishes, in the neighborhoods, sharing the good news. So how do we do that better? That's what I want to try to address in this talk. And central to doing the work of evangelization better is to understand the people to whom God sends us. You know, being a marketing major in college and in the business world for a while, one of the most vital things that you really had to get down is knowing your audience. And most applicable to us is what obstacles does this person in front of me need to overcome in order to encounter our Lord Jesus? What is keeping him or her from being an intentional disciple? Thus, this talk on the thresholds. But it's really more than just the talk on the thresholds, because Adam had wanted me to cover 3 things. And those 3 things is, number 1, having an awareness of those 3 concurrent spiritual journeys that people are on. Number 2, having an awareness of those 5 thresholds of conversion that people normally break through in becoming an intentional disciple. And then 3, my experience with fireside chats as an example of the need for various entryways into the church, shallower entry points into the church, and also the importance of Christian community. All right, so before, because this is one of the first talks, I want to provide a little bit of context that I think will help us understand the importance of all the presentations you'll be hearing, and in particular, these 3 points. So before we go into those 3 points, I want to point out a foundational human attribute that will provide insight on why these topics are so important. We all know we're made in the image and likeness of God, right? So that's why we are free, rational, moral human persons. And these personal qualities of human persons are what give us the capacity to love, which is the very heart of who God is. God is love, and thus in himself cannot be alone, all right? That's why we believe in the Trinity. Remember what Augustine says, wherever there's love, there's 3 realities. There is the lover, the beloved, and the love they share. And so we can see why our God, who is one, but one in 3 persons. The fact that we are made in the image and likeness of a God who is love means also that we are inherently relational persons. And that relationality is even stamped into our very bodies. We and our equipment don't make sense by ourselves. So this should then give us profound insight on exactly why the more powerful motivator oftentimes for people's decisions and actions, more powerful than reason and what is morally right and wrong, is how my decision and action affect my relations with other people, especially my loved ones. If people actually base their decisions on reason and morality and what is true, then, the work of evangelization would be much easier, wouldn't it? And we'd have people becoming more Christians around. So no one wants to be alone, all right? No one wants to be ostracized from their peers, their loved ones, their social groups, because that would go against the very heart of who we are as inherently relational beings. And so that's why we have to approach our evangelization not just with our logic and apologetics, but appeal to the relational dimension of the person. Especially now that in our land of sound bites and constant distraction, Folks don't take as much time to think deeply, to think profoundly, to think logically. It's all the more important then to begin on this level of trust and relationship. It doesn't mean that we end there, of course, but oftentimes people's arguments are just excuses that hide the real reasons for disagreement, for example, because of what recognizing a truth may mean for my relationships, or having to face the wounds from a broken relationship. That's why we have to try to lead them to that place where they can encounter our Lord Jesus, which is the relationship that breaks through all those doctrinal and moral hiccups people can have in recognizing the truth. So part of the problem is that more than half of all Catholics are not even sure that you can even have a personal relationship with God. In fact, 29% of Catholics, according to the Pew Religious Landscape survey, believe that God is an impersonal force. Despite, what we teach, because it's obviously very much the opposite of that. So no wonder lots of Catholics think Mass is boring. Right? They don't get anything out of it if you don't even believe that you can have a personal relationship with God. Our divine worship has no effect on our relationship with God. That's what a lot of Catholics believe. So they don't think they can relate to God, that God can relate to them. And so as evangelizers, then, we got to change that. Right? So now we've laid that foundation of our inherent relationality as human beings. That now we can introduce these thresholds of conversion. Now these are the thresholds that people normally have to break through in their journey to becoming and arriving at being at intentional discipleship. Before one is a disciple of Jesus, one has to break through that threshold of spiritually seeking. Right? They have to find what they're looking for. And so, Jesus doesn't force himself on us, but wants us to come to him freely. Seek and you shall find. But before one is seeking, one has had to break through the threshold of being spiritually open. And openness is hard to come by. That's probably one of the biggest hurdles, if not the top hurdle, that people get caught up in. Open to the possibility, just the possibility of personal and spiritual change. Opening oneself to change can be difficult. That you and I know that, right? We might go to confession for the same exact thing. Time after time after time. Before one is even spiritually open, though, they normally have to be able to be at least spiritually curious. So that threshold, they have to be somewhat intrigued by the person of Jesus or the question of Christianity and Jesus' teachings or some aspect of the Christian faith. But before they're even spiritually curious about Jesus and the Christian life, they have to have some kind of initial trust or some kind of positive association with Jesus Christ, the church, or a Christian believer. So that's kind of a summation overview of the thresholds. Now we'll go into each one in more detail, starting with that first initial threshold, number 1, which is initial trust. Now, to give you an example, I'd like to share with you what I did in this as the first year in my being pastor at St. John in Jackson, which was just this last year, actually. I was taking over a popular pastor who had been there for 19 years. And he was a master of names of a parish of about 2,000 families. All of us are a part of a parish, right? So parish leaders need to be mindful that not only of accompanying individual people along these thresholds, but accompanying your parish through those thresholds, right? The parish at large, so that you have a community that is able to trust, you have a community that is spiritually curious, you have a spiritually open community, and one that's seeking the Lord so that they are truly following the Lord as disciples. So I wanted to dedicate the first year to taking the parish on these fireside chats, taking them through that first hold of trust by having these fireside chats. What are they? They're evenings that average about 17 people at parishioner homes around the city. What we did was we plotted 2,000 families, the 2,000 plus families, onto a map. Jeremy had a huge hand in that, and we would merge our database with a software called Mission Insight, and then we saw the clusters, and we grouped them into neighborhoods of about 100, right? 100 household each, so that was about 21 different neighborhoods. Then I asked for volunteers from the parish, and that opening homily of anybody that would want to open up their home to host their fellow parishioners. And everyone from that neighborhood would be invited in the home of someone who lived in their area. Of course, we had to limit the number of people based on the size of the living room, but it averaged about 17 people per fireside chat. Now, the format would be about the first half hour, 6:30 to 7. We would have, mingling, getting our name tags on. And then from 7 to 8:30, we would always make sure to limit it because of respecting people's times and the host time as well. But from 7 to 8:30, we would have one common discussion. And there was no set talk, there's no set topics. It was whatever people wanted. And that way, it wasn't boring for Jeremy and I because each night was different. People would bring up different things. And so each one was exciting for us as well. Now, this obviously doesn't get to all the families out there, but this first year of Fireside Chats gave me the opportunity to take a spiritual pulse of the parish, to see where they're at, right? In a general sense. And it accomplished 3 specific aims. The first was to get solidarity between the pastor and the parishioners, to get the smell of the sheep, as Pope Francis likes to say. And so that addresses that first threshold of initial trust. A second aim was for parishioners to connect with one another. Many didn't even know each other. I mean, Kathy was at one of those, and so was Cindy. Cindy hosted one. So the third, actually, there was one, 2 houses from across each other, 15 years, they've been waving hello, good morning, and all that stuff. And then they meet at the fireside chat down the street, and they said, I didn't know you were Catholic. I didn't know you were, after all these years of saying hello, they just went to different masses, all right? Anyway, the third aim, and one that's very apt to what we're doing here, is identifying more of those intentional disciples that we can recruit then who would be willing to partner with us to be those apostles that would reach out to the rest of the parish. And that way they could be somewhat of a formation team for the rest of the parish. Missionary discipleship is, of course, the culmination of intentional discipleship. So that's where we get people who will do things like St. Paul Street evangelization. So the disciples are called to go out on mission, which is why we're all here. So let's now apply this first threshold to street evangelization. So imagine yourself on the other side. Maybe you can picture yourself over at the Dream Cruise, being the non-believer that this Christian has approached. Do I trust or have some kind of positive association with that Christian person? Because if I don't trust a person that just approached me, what's going to change me? Some kind of positive happening, right? A positive encounter with you, Joe or Susie Christian, where our interaction creates that positive association. That's why for the street evangelizer, your first impressions are very key, right? If you have a sad face or just like bitter at the world, or at least you look like you're bitter at the world, am I going to want to relate with you? No. I'm going to try to do anything but look your way as I'm passing by. But if you have a sincere smile, one that doesn't make you, like you look like you're from the movie The Shining or Psycho, then I have to try to look away, and I'll feel guilty for doing so because human decency calls for a smile to be, with a warm greeting, to be recognized and reciprocated. Threshold number 2 then, spiritual curiosity. So let's say you seem trustworthy enough that I actually stop and hear what you have to say. Now we have to address threshold number 2 of with some delicacy here. So it's not just being kind. You have to intrigue me and give me a reason not to walk away. So it's about relationships. You somehow need to connect with me. And that's why one of the best ways to get a conversation going and to rouse curiosity is by asking questions, right? Not providing answers, asking questions. May I offer you a rosary? Is there anything I can pray for in your life? Where do you sense God in your life? Or who do you think Jesus is? Well, what do you think about Pope Francis coming to America in a month, right? Or simply, what is your lived experience of God? That's the starting question of a threshold conversation. What is your lived experience with God? Do you have any kind of relationship with Him now? So rousing spiritual curiosity, there's other ways to doing that other than just asking questions, especially if you're not under pressure on the street. But in our everyday life with those around us, arousing spiritual curiosity is simply living out our countercultural faith with joy and holiness and being able to give a reason for your hope, as St. Peter says. And we're all going to work on that from what I just heard. Everybody's going to be able to write a snippet of their testimony and to know that. But to foster curiosity, use the Jesus method. Instead of Q&A, he's a Q and Q, right? He keeps on asking questions. Some of the examples. What do you want me to do for you? How do you read the law? He's asking them, right? Where is everyone? Has no one condemned you? We all know where that came from. Who do people say that I am? What are you looking for? So our primary task at this threshold is not catechetical to answer factual questions. We have to arouse curiosity, spiritual curiosity. And so whether it's by conversation or the witness of your life, let's say you've been able to do it, okay? You've intrigued me, and now I'm willing to go further in a spiritual conversation. Now what do I say? Do I go off on some monologue at that point? No. It's actually the very opposite. We listen. Just like Jesus at the woman at the well, right? After asking the questions, he listens, and he feeds on the response that she gives. So it's really a time for listening to what they say through this threshold conversation, which helps you discern what threshold a person is currently at, if he or she already is not a disciple. Sherry calls these threshold conversations, quote, the prayerful act of listening evangelization. The prayerful act of listening evangelization. And after Evangelii Gaudium came out, there's a section there that is very similar to what Sherry calls us to with this prayerful act of listening. Pope Francis describes it as spiritual accompaniment, and he has a whole section on that. Remember, 169 to about 172 or something like that? Here's what he says in 171, quote, we need to practice the art of listening, which is more than simply hearing. Listening in communication is an openness of heart, which makes possible that closeness without which genuine spiritual encounter cannot occur. Listening helps us to find the right gesture and word, which shows that we are more than simply bystanders. Only through such respectful and compassionate listening can we enter on the paths of true growth and awaken a yearning for the Christian ideal, the desire to respond fully to God's love and to bring to fruition what he has sown in our lives. So that's Evangelii Gaudium 171. And he says that everybody in the church needs to be trained in spiritual accompaniment. Not just the priests and religious, but the lay faithful most especially, because you are the ones who are out in the world. You know, I've got a busy enough time trying to minister to the people who are coming to, darkening the doors of the church. It's you all that my way of evangelization primarily is by investing in the evangelizers. Right? Okay, so Pope Francis wants to bring people along to respond more fully to the good news. And this art of listening, spiritual accompaniment, is central to understanding what the obstacles are for a person to arrive at faith. Through it, Pope Francis says that we can, quote, make present the fragrance of Christ's closeness and his personal gaze. Remember the story of the rich young man, right? We saw there Jesus reaching out to him, and it says there, quote, and Jesus looking at him, loved him, and said to him, you lack one thing. Go sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. Why did John have to say all that stuff before Jesus opened his mouth? I mean, he really took the time to say, and Jesus, looking at him, so engaging him, looking him in the eye, right? Looking at him, then it says, loved him. So Jesus took the time to love the person in front of him before even saying anything. So by Jesus' gaze, before he gave him that difficult challenge, Jesus loved him. Do you look at people with his personal loving gaze that invites them to an open heart? As people are walking up and down the sidewalk or at the Dream Cruise, you can love them in your heart before you even talk to them, right? And that'll be made known to them through your personal loving gaze. You know, when you look at Mother Teresa and how she looks at the poor, it's different, right? So, don't fake a personal gaze or you'll look like a weirdo. But anyway, so Pope Francis continues commenting on this spiritual act, this art of spiritual accompaniment, which is essentially what you're doing for an albeit brief time on the sidewalk. It says, quote, the church will have to initiate everyone, priests, religious, and laity, into this art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. The pace of this accompaniment must be steady and reassuring, reflecting our closeness and our compassionate gaze, which also heals, liberates, and encourages growth in the Christian life. So notice here the importance the Holy Father places on relationships. You know, he understands inherently our inherent relationality of the human person. Now, here's where Pope Francis' spiritual accompaniment becomes even more like threshold conversations. He makes a very good point. He says that we can't stop at compassion, solidarity, and charity if we are to be authentic, if those things are authentic. He says, quote, spiritual accompaniment must lead others ever closer to God, in whom we attain true freedom. Some people think that they are free if they can avoid God. They fail to see that they remain existentially orphaned, helpless, homeless. They cease being pilgrims and become drifters, flitting around themselves and never getting anywhere, he says. To accompany them would be counterproductive if it became a sort of therapy, supporting their self-absorption and ceased to be a pilgrimage with Christ to the Father. It becomes counterproductive if we just go halfway, if we don't go the full way of evangelization. In other words, the healing we seek for others shouldn't set its sights, just halfway, where people simply become emotionally stable. Then leaving them at this point, they would continue to kind of live in their own bubble of narcissism or self-absorption. So true and complete healing will lead one to a life of generosity, right? And a spirit of service for others, a life patterned after Christ and after encountering Christ. So Pope Francis concludes that section. Genuine spiritual accompaniment always begins and flourishes in the context of service to the mission of evangelization. That's the true end of spiritual accompaniment. And that's what this threshold conversation, the aim of the threshold conversation is about, right? So if you want to understand Francis, he's trying to do with the whole world what we're called to do with individuals in our sphere of influence. But now back to the very similar threshold conversations. What we do in these threshold conversations is prayerfully listen for, quote, seeds of the word, and to where a person has been spiritually and where they are presently spiritually. A lot of people will label themselves this or that, right? Whether it's atheist or agnostic or Buddhist or Christian. I might look Buddhist, but I am Catholic. Or even, practicing or fallen away Catholic. Don't take labels for what they are, because oftentimes they'll have a different meaning from what you attach labels to. So ask what they mean by the label, since what they mean may not always be what you think it means. For example, 55% of those who identify as agnostic actually believe in God. Does that make sense? So 55% of people who are agnostic actually believe in God. So ask, what do you mean by atheist, if somebody says atheist? And tell me about this God that you don't believe in. And is there, if you don't believe in God, what about any other kind of higher power? So you're mining for spiritual seeking on their part, all right? If there's no indication that they're actively seeking, they're probably need to arrive at that threshold of spiritual openness first, which is a passive disposition, right? The difference between spiritual openness and ratcheting it up to spiritual seeking is active. Spiritual openness is still a passive disposition. So what are some ways that you can encourage someone in their curiosity, their spirit, you've got them spiritually curious, to actually be open to personal and spiritual change? First, listen to their story, as we've talked about, their story of their relationship with God thus far. And then, like for example, during these fireside chats, the parishioners actually spoke more than I did. I didn't even oftentimes even get to introduce myself because they were talking so much about various things. And as they describe their story, see if you can recognize God working in their life, and then feeding that back to them, what they've shared with you, and pointing out God's presence and providence in those moments. And then, after you've mined that, tell the great story of Jesus, right? The kerygma. Share that so that they can respond to it. Encourage them to pray. These are ways to encourage people to spiritual openness. Encourage them to pray, and then ask if you can pray for them to be open to God. So you're asking them to pray. We're going to pray for them. But then, if things are going well, you can ask if you can pray with them right there, with them, for that openness. And if things are going well at that point, give them the opportunity to acknowledge their openness to God. Maybe by inviting them to, to pray a prayer to repeat after you or something like that, right? Next threshold, threshold number 4, spiritual seeking. People who need to break through the threshold of spiritually seeking are already spiritually open to the possibility to change. But they are passive about it, like as we mentioned. They have to yet actively seek the Lord. So to encourage them to do so, do similar things that you would do to encourage openness. But instead of just simply praying for openness, have them to pray for a heart that's desirous of the Lord. One that actively pursues Jesus. Share with them. This is a good time now, because remember those initial stages, we're allowing them to do a lot of the talking, Q and Q. But it's at this stage that your testimony might do some good. Right? It may encourage them to seek and desire Jesus as you did. Now that they've been heard, they're more likely to have open ears to hear what you have to say. Right? Folks have we just experienced a beautiful Mass, and after, I'm talking about a wedding here, because I do this a lot in weddings. They're on a spiritual high, they're celebratory, they've had a few, and so they're open to these kinds of questions. And challenge them to pray in different ways is another way of having them move forward in this threshold. Having them challenge them to go to adoration, pray the rosary, and then have, especially if you're doing street evangelization, maybe have the local times and addresses for those places. Invite them to something where the environment may be a little more conducive for igniting the flame of faith. Maybe have material that lists events that they can go to. I mean, somebody was talking about night fever. Chris was talking about night fever, right? Have that information armed with you to invite them to go to night fever. Get their contact information, and better yet, go with them. Accompany them if you're in the area. Ask if it's okay that if you give their contact information to other disciples in the area, if you're just visiting, right? So bearing witness by words is good, but nothing replaces experiencing authentic Christian life for instilling that desire in them for a similar relationship with the Lord. Intercession is very important at this stage. So have intercessors praying for your efforts. Because there's so many influences that prevent people from finally being open. Our fallen nature, family and friends, the culture, the enemy, the world, they all conspire to block a move into openness to God. Now, spiritually, the seekers intentionally seek resolution. So this is the part where now we've gone from passive to now how do we approach somebody that is actually seeking? And that's a lot easier, right? We just have to accompany them along, invite them, and the Lord, and have the Lord do the work. And then they finally arrive at intentional discipleship. People who need to break through that threshold of intentional discipleship, those who are seeking, they have, as Sherry puts it, they are dating with a purpose. Dating with a purpose, but they're not at marriage yet. They just need to get over the hump and drop their nets, another image that she uses, to drop their nets as the first disciples did, making that conscious commitment to follow Jesus unreservedly in the midst of the church, and then also to reorder their life accordingly. Now, to encourage this, for them to get over the hump, share with them about your own ups and downs. So not only share your testimony, but now share the trials and tribulations and the joys of your own spiritual life. Because that reveals to them that you don't have to be perfect to be an intentional disciple of Jesus Christ. Help them to confront personal sin by connecting freedom with a life of virtue. And help them to realize that they have something to offer to build up God's kingdom. Right? Make them feel useful because they are. The laborers are few. Right? The harvest is plenty, the laborers are few. I will make you fishers of men. Another way is lead them in a prayer of surrender. Maybe use the suscipe of St. Ignatius. The take, Lord, receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, my entire will. All that I have and possess, you have given all to me, and to you, O Lord, I return it. All is yours. Give me your love and your grace, for that is sufficient for me. So give them information on a retreat. That's another way. Connect them with other disciples, once again. So these thresholds are focused on a lived relationship with Christ, and the ultimate aim of which is to become his true disciple. There are two other spiritual journeys that are concurrent with it, but can sometimes be disjointed in the current way that we approach a lot of parish ministry. The other two journeys are, number one, the journey into the church through receiving the sacraments of initiation. And then the second one is the journey of active practice, of participating in the life and mission of the local Christian community. So sometimes that can be out of whack with our spiritual journey with Christ. We plan to hopefully change that at St. John. We're working to, we hired a new director of faith formation, Todd Gale, and he'll be integrating the preaching of the Kerygma with all the sacramental preparation from infant baptisms and first communions to RCIA to marriages and marriage preparation, as well as the formation of the life of virtue, so that things are going in the same direction, right? We want to follow Pope Francis's encouragement that the church needs to initiate the lay faithful on how to go about spiritually accompanying people. So we're doing that with regards to this creation of what we're calling parish representatives that represent about those dozen different areas. We had all those neighborhoods. And so we're going to use those neighborhoods and have at least one woman and one man from each area who would then serve as kind of a liaison of sorts between the pastoral staff and the parishioners. And they would be versed in the thresholds and how to hold a threshold conversation, so that hopefully one day all our parishioners will have had a threshold conversation. And also, for those who are familiar with called and gifted, a discernment of their charisms. So eventually we'd love to get representatives of different ages from each area, and all of these parish representatives would then be trained in spiritual accompaniment. They'd also promote small groups, which I understand is going to be coming up with St. Paul Street Evangelization. So that's great. Because we want to truly create a parish, a community, an organization in which the people of God live the mystery of that we celebrate on the altar, right? And what is that mystery? The one body of Christ. Right now, in many of these big parishes of 2,000 households or more, you could be missed Mass for months and nobody had missed you, right? How many parishioners even see each other outside of Sunday Mass? Mass is what more, I like to call the sacramental slot machine. We go in there, get the Eucharist, and then walk out, and we don't see each other for until the next week, if we're lucky. So no wonder we have so many leaving for churches of our evangelical brethren, where there is often a greater sense of community. But we hope gathering together a strong cadre of intentional disciples in the parish, who in turn are going to be able to reach out in some way to every household in the parish, that we can turn that around. We're here in the hallowed halls of Sacred Heart Major Seminary, the house of formation for our seminarians, right? So I want to use that analogy of the rector and the vice rector for the model that we need at a parish. the house of formation. What's the parish? The house of formation for the lay faithful. Where else are they going to get it? See, in the seminary, the rector is in charge of overall operations, while the vice rector, he is in charge of the individual formation of each seminarian. And so what a lot of parishes are missing is a vice rector position. Someone in charge of the individual formation of each of the lay faithful, who coordinates the activity of all those parish representatives who reach out to the parishioners directly. So we have, hopefully in Todd Gale, and hopefully it might be a two-person job. We hope to maybe get a female pastoral associate. But because of the size of the role, it probably will be a two-person job. But I want to close with this quote from John Paul the Great. The parish will necessarily be the center of the new evangelization, and thus parish life must be renewed in all its dimensions. The parish will necessarily be the center of the new evangelization, and thus parish life must be renewed in all its dimensions. And St. Paul Street evangelization is one of those key things that we can bring into the parish that will bring in the new life that's needed. So thank you for listening, and God bless your efforts.